You can take a flower, roll it up and make it fine. Sprinkle it with knowledge and a little bit of time. Cover it with headlines and a sweet euphoria too. Cannabis man, cannabis man, cannabis man. Spreading news and joy across the land. Diving deep into the growing green. Cannabis man, we're all keen.
Oh, yeah. Welcome into another episode of the Cannabis Man Podcast. Thank you so much for clicking on the show and giving this a listen. I am your host, Don Kleppen, and I created this show a few years back because I wanted to take a journalistic look at all things legal cannabis. I'm a personal cannabis user of about 20 years, and I have been doing broadcasting in Chicago for the last 13 or so. I've worked in newsrooms and radio reporting throughout the city and done some traffic as well at different points. You can hear me on WGN Radio Saturday mornings with House Smarts and Home Sweet Home Chicago, and I fill in on that station 7:20 a.m. on other times as well. Come holiday time, you'll be able to hear me around there a lot more. But as I said, I've used it on my own. I found it helped me get to sleep at night, which was something I'd always struggled with growing up, helped me get over some, workout pains, recovery issues from, whether it was athletic injuries or just lifting, whatever. Also, finding that it helped me with exercising. Taking an edible and going for a long run was something I enjoyed. I always used to hit those volcano bags. If you've ever used one of those vaporizers, they fill the plastic bags up. I'd take one of those down and go for a long run, and really, really enjoyed it for different reasons. And I just was hoping that once it became legalized, started to become legalized around different states in the U.S., that the conversations in legacy media channels like, TV, radio, these places people turn to, newspapers as well still, along with, mainstream channels on the internet, I was hoping that the conversations around cannabis would change from the questioning what we do and don't know and sort of continuing to repeat last century's propaganda to the, more rational discourse that I'd had with people at parties for years, back to when cannabis was still illegal, but we were all smoking it anyway, and what we had discovered for ourselves being that cannabis was helpful and certainly not that detrimental as we'd been told. Those conversations never really materialized. And so that's what led me to starting the Cannabis Man podcast here. And this has grown to the number one indie news podcast on the Good Pods podcast platform. It's also a top 5 society and culture, along with indie cannabis podcast on that platform. Very, very grateful for those accolades. And this show is being heard in all 50 states and in 85 countries around the world, which is something I'm still getting used to. It's kind of crazy that something that I just kind of started here on my own in Chicago has grown to this point, and I can't thank you enough for the support. And on that note, if you haven't already, leave a rating or review for the show, however you're getting this, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. There's a way you can subscribe, leave a comment, leave a rating, like it, any of that, and share it with your friends if you think they might like this. Tell people who are interested in cannabis information that I'm doing this podcast and that it's available for them with new episodes every week. You can also follow activity of the show on social media. It's the Cannabis Man Podcast Facebook page, and it's at C-Man Podcast on X and Instagram. And I also expanded this operation here that I'm doing on the podcast. I launched a newsletter on Substack called The Weekly Chronic, and it's kind of a companion piece to this. I cover news stories that I can't get to on the podcast, offer some behind-the-scenes looks. I talk about the interviews done here, look ahead to next week's episode, and I'm looking to give some bonus content there, as well as some kind of deeper dives and perspective in print on the various topics facing the cannabis community and kind of looking ahead as different countries and states are legalizing this plant around the world. Very exciting time. And another thing I like to do on the show is talk with people in that space, that being legal cannabis, this green frontier that's always changing. There are professionals all around this country and the world who are, whether they're doctors, researchers looking in to answer some of the questions that remain, or if they're people covering the space like myself, or policy leaders legislators, elected or appointed, that are making the rules, which are going to become the foundations for legal cannabis states and countries all around going forward. And I also like talking with entrepreneurs, business owners, people who have created products or services that we all get to try, all of us connoisseurs, or even if you're just kind of curious and you end up wandering into the space one day. We're all benefiting from the work that's being done right now by all the great people in the space, and I like bringing those conversations to you here on the Cannabis Man podcast. And on that note, I have one such conversation today. This man has been fighting this fight against the stigma of cannabis and, advocating for its legalization and responsible use and all of that for decades now. He is the deputy director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. I'm talking about Paul Armentano. He's been on the show before. He is back today. We talk about several different topics, including the election, which is just under 2 weeks away. I know that if you're like me, you'll look forward to seeing the end of those text messages, the campaign notices we're all constantly getting. It'll be nice to be on the other side of those. But we talk about how it's the first ever election that both candidates support legalizing. We also discuss the DEA's timeline for rescheduling, that December 2nd hearing. Paul gives some perspective on that, as well as the time in the past, back in the 80s, that a judge did weigh in on this issue, hear how that went. And then the issue of underage use, which has still been a rallying cry for a long time for opponents of cannabis legalization. Paul kind of breaks that down and debunks it as well. Law enforcement numbers in terms of cannabis arrests, which we just got in the time that Paul and I spoke, they were from the month of August. So we got those FBI arrest totals, and Paul kind of gives perspective on that. And Florida is one of the states with a cannabis ballot initiative, as well as electing president. All states have usually some issues or local candidates at least on the ballots as well. And in Florida, along with some other states, they are weighing in on legalizing cannabis recreationally. That's Amendment 3 down there. So Paul and I kind of break that down, as well as some different stereotypes and studies and a whole lot more coming up in that conversation. So definitely stick around for that. I also have the News Joint Wrap, where I share a wrap-up of news stories and events coming up relating to cannabis, as well as finally getting into a batch of products that Sweet Buzz sent me. These are edible creators, Sweet Buzz, people who are veterans of the candy industry, so they know how to make a tasty treat, and now they're having great fun and benefiting all of us in the legal cannabis space. There are some great treats that they have on dispensary shelves that you can get just in time for Halloween, at least for you and yours to enjoy. That can be your candy, as well as, hey, hand them out to your friends who are of age. If they're trick-or-treating, hey, this is a fun sort of adult spin on the whole Halloween thing. But I get into a review of Sweet Buzz's signature treat, their Sweet Sparks, and I'll tell you about my thoughts of those and some other national news stories relating to those topics as well. So let's get into it right here on the Cannabis Man podcast.
This is Tommy Chong, and you're listening to the Cannabis Broadcast.
Yeah, yes, indeed. You know, I got to tell you, it is just so lovely this time of year. Wherever you are in the world, the time of fall is just such a joy. But here in the Midwest especially, the fall colors have really settled into Chicago now. If you're in this area like I am, if you're around the city, going to the big parks like Millennium or Grant Park, or even smaller ones on the north side like Burger Park along Sheridan Road, my wife and I go there all the time. There's plenty of green spaces in the city, which are increasingly multicolored spaces now because the leaves are changing red and yellows and orange, and it is just so wonderful. Just last night, going outside, my wife and I taking Violet out in her stroller, 6 months old now, and she's just looking at the trees, kind of very excited to just take it all in. It's her first fall, and it's definitely special for us to walk around, and I had a little bit of a smoke last night before we were pushing that stroller around, and it just made me reflective and introspective, just kind of being grateful for another witnessing of this season. And we all know where it goes. It heads to winter now, and certainly around Chicago and the rest of the Midwest, it definitely gets brutally cold here, as well as plenty of other places around the world. Winter is not exactly pleasant for anybody, I don't think, unless you're on the west coast of America. They just never seem to get anything but lovely weather unless it's raining or something else. But either way, it's just a wonderful time to be around the nice chill in the air, lots of football on the TV, lots of, crock pot meals, whether it's soups or stews or pasta or whatever your pleasure is. There's some great cold weather foods that are now in season, along with, comfy flannel pajamas and sweaters and all of that good stuff, along with bonfires and crunchy leaves on the ground, the crisp chill to the air. Very, very nice stuff going on out there. It's a great time to enjoy cannabis and just kind of reflect on the progress that we've made. And my guest today, Paul Armentano, has some great perspective on that, as he's been doing this for 3 decades now, for 30 years. He really has seen it go from what it was like last century, not too far removed from the Nixon administration and the height of the war on drugs, to where we are today, sort of knocking on the doorstep of rescheduling it down to Schedule 3. And, as if Kamala Harris, ends up getting in there and keeps her campaign pledge to legalize it fully, we're on the doorstep of the repeal of prohibition of cannabis. And so there has been a lot of progress. And whether you feel it or not, whether you're in a state or country where it's legalized or not, whether you can sort of witness it in front of you or not, the goalposts are moving, the fault lines are changing here, the frontier's growing, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful time to be alive. If you are someone who's been in this space like I have, using it, we used to dream about these days, man. These conversations that are happening nationally, these states that are actually debating this and having ballot initiatives like Florida, like South Dakota, like Nebraska, these states that are actually weighing joining the ranks of those of us like Illinois, like California, Michigan, Missouri, or Colorado or Washington, any of the others that have joined the ranks. We're at 24 recreational states now, 38, I believe, for medical, and that's not even including Washington, D.C., or some of the other U.S. territories that have done it. So it is wonderful, and just reflecting on that progress certainly keeps me in high spirits, and as does taking a peruse across IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Dipping into the News Joint wrap now, this is the joint you can hit for all your Illinois cannabis news and reviews. And I want to start with Illinois' September cannabis sales. They dipped to $136 million. Jason Brown wrote this article. IDFPR, the State Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, took a look at the recreational cannabis sales totals for September. And for the first time in 7 months, monthly totals dipped below $140 million, hitting the third lowest total this year at $136,508,866.78 since 2020. August and September months, and even October, according to Jason, have reached similar monthly totals. The largest decrease in monthly sales totals usually happens between the months of December to January and then January to February. Jason also lists the rest of 2024's monthly sales totals, along with the last few years back to legalization as well. In addition to news stories, there are lots of great reviews here on IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Some recent ones include Cherry Pop-Tart by Caviar, Strawberry Lemonade Drink Mix by Vibations. If you heard my interview with Ryan Crandall of Vibations, I love what they're doing. The mixable powder that they have, really great stuff, and so that review is worth checking out, along with Caribbean Sunset Pod by Arrow. And then for an event coming up on Tuesday, October 29th, it's the Best in Grass ceremony. You have heard me talk about the Best in Grass edibles kit, the gummies that I went through between August and September, up to earlier this month when judging closed on the 13th. Well, the awards ceremony for those who are winners in those categories in Best in Grass for Illinois, that ceremony is Tuesday, October 29th. It's at 322 West Armitage Avenue at Park West. Mark Kazanik. Kaz, you may remember if you heard that interview with him, listener, a few episodes back when this contest, this competition hit the ground running there. He said this was going to be sort of a red carpet event, and they're going to open the doors at 6. The event starts at 7 o'clock, and the competition featured 30-plus brands, 120 product entries, and hundreds of thousands of grams of cannabis, including flower, concentrates, vape pens, and edibles. The categories for judging included indica and sativa flower, along with hybrid, pre-rolls, along with infused pre-rolls. There were solvent concentrates, edible gummies, edibles non-gummies, syrups and beverages, and a whole lot of medical categories as well for all the products. Going to be a heck of a fun time, and you can get tickets for the Best in Grass ceremony, along with finding more details about the stories that I mentioned, all at IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Now I'd like to get into my product of the week and tell you kind of what I have been sampling this week in terms of cannabis products, and I have so been looking forward to getting into this batch of products from Sweet Buzz. You may remember my interview, listener, with Elisa Brill, who works at Sweet Buzz, and if you haven't listened to it, I recommend it. Go back and check it out. She's a lovely woman working with some candy industry veterans who worked for a long time for another company, and they got very comfortable making delicious products and then decided to move into the cannabis space, and now they are making delicious products and infusing them with wonderful cannabis. And I got into this week their signature product, which is Sweet Sparks, kind of the Sweet Buzz take on M&Ms. They are a candy-coated chocolate, very just small and round. They are purple in color, which I loved, kind of a dark purple, definitely Halloween-y, which I know they're selling them year-round, but it's very in with the Halloween theme, and I felt that. And they sort of touch on how they sell, when I spoke with Elisa Brill, she mentioned they sell non-infused versions of these. Those are just on shelves because the candy's that good. And then these Sweet Sparks After Dark are the THC-infused candies. This batch and all their Sweet Sparks come at 1 THC milligram per candy. And so that was something I found really, really fascinating. The ability to customize dosage by single increments of milligrams, just one per candy, one dose. And that was something that my wife Gretchen actually was really fascinated by, enough so that she took her first edible, which was a Sweet Spark from Sweet Buzz. She just took that a little while ago after work, and it's because it's the 1 milligram. It's her first in a year after finding out she was pregnant with Violet and then going through the delivery, and now Violet's 6 months old. This is the first time Gretchen has had an edible since before that, and she was missing them and looking forward to the next time, but she didn't want to start, building up her tolerance again after such a long gap with starting with a 5 milligram or a 10. The times we have to ourselves where someone else is watching Violet, they're just few and far between. So we haven't really gotten a chance to have several hours, just the two of us, where maybe taking one of those larger grade edibles would have been, sort of a thing for her to do. That is where these Sweet Buzz Sweet Sparks were just perfect, allowing for an M&M with 1 milligram of THC. You're not really risking too much. Maybe she feels it. If she doesn't, she can always take another one. But if she does, then it's like, great. It's a very small grade that she feels, and I'm just happy that she's kind of able to get back on this journey and, get a little bit of that social lubrication, a little bit of that stress relief that all of us get from ingesting cannabis products. And I got to say, for my money, I took 5 of these things. I took 2 at first because I saw they were 1 milligram, so I wanted to start with 2, and I was legitimately planning to just keep it at 2. But no joke here, and I'm disclosing, this is an unpaid sponsorship. I just really enjoy what Sweet Buzz is doing. So they're not paying me to say these things. I'm just telling you my experience as I was eating these. I planned to have 2, and then very quickly popped 3 more in my mouth because they were just that delicious. The shell, the candy shell on the outside, the purple color, a little softer than M&M's. It was an easy bite through, but the chocolate was delicious. You get just a whiff, a very small hint of infusion. You know, the sort of THC taste. You can tell that it's not an M&M. You get a little bit of this evidence of sort of like, you know, if you're taking a dessert shot, you know, a chocolate, you know, Di Serono out of like a mint chocolate cup or something like that, you know, or maybe Bailey's or something. It's sweet, and the majority of it is sweet, but there is just a little hint of something in there, so you know you're getting the alcohol in the case of Bailey's, and you kind of know you're getting the THC in these sweet sparks. But that is quick to fade, and then you're just left with the candy shell taste and the chocolate just fading away nicely on your palate. And that chocolate taste was the one that I felt lasted the longest for me. And like I said, I'm sitting here now about half an hour after taking the 5 of those, and I noticed that I was able to feel them a little bit after about 15 to 20 minutes, being able to feel the first one. And now, you know, so taking 5, I roughly took 5 milligrams of THC, and it's not enough for me to feel like I'm impaired in any way, but I do definitely feel it, and it is a pleasant buzz. There in the background, my mind is not, as I said, it's not too sluggish. It's not really keeping me, these sweet sparks wouldn't keep me from doing anything that I otherwise wanted to do, unless maybe I downed half the pack of them or more, which I will say is a distinct possibility because my sweet tooth really just knows no bounds. If I try 1 or 2 of these things, I will inhale a lot of them, and that's a real risk because these are absolutely delicious. The candy side of them is top-notch. It is right up there with the best candies that you would find on a regular grocery store shelf. And as I said at the beginning, the ability to customize your dosage by 1 milligram of THC at a time, I think that is just wonderful. And that is something that not a lot of cannabis products will offer you. You will be dealing a lot of the time with a higher floor, with 5 milligrams or 10 or 20. Some of these things, some of these edibles are made at that grade, and that's as low as they're going to go. So being able to have like an M&M version, this sweet spark, which has THC in it, and you can just kind of take as few or as many as you'd like. I love that, and I just think that Sweet Buzz is really making a nice coming out party at perfect timing right around Halloween as we're all kind of, you know, getting set to ingest a little more candy than I think we do the rest of the year. So head to getsweetbuzz.com, and you can find a store locator. You can find out where these products are nearest you, and if you're lucky enough to live in a state where they are selling, make your candy of the infused variety this Halloween and get a Sweet Buzz like I have going on right now. And I am so looking forward to getting into some of the rest of their stellar line of products. You can hear more about them on future episodes, and I'll be diving into them on the weekly Chronic newsletter as well. You can always subscribe to that for free by heading to Substack or my website, donkleppen.com, and you can click on the link, and that'll take you to the page where you can subscribe. But I'm so looking forward to trying more of these, and you really owe it to yourself to give these a shot too. These are the kinds of innovations from great product makers like the people at Sweet Buzz. They know what they're doing. They know how to make good tasting treats. And now they're infusing these so that all of us connoisseurs get to enjoy a sweet treat that gives you a sweet buzz on the back end of it too. Now, the other product I wanted to tell you about that I have been on this week comes from a brand that I've really been getting into lately. This comes from the Tales and Travels brand. I really love their marketing, the imagery on some of their products, and this one, which is the Grande Guava flavor of flower. It's a crossover from guava and gelato. And Tales and Travels is a subsidiary of Revolution. You've likely heard of the Revolution company and brand of cannabis products, lots of smaller brands underneath them, just like a lot of the other cannabis companies. There's only a handful, and then all the brands you see on dispensary shelves are owned by just kind of those handful of the large operators, Revolution being one of them. But on the nutrition label on the back side here, this is a sativa, this Grande Guava strain here from Tales and Travels. The THC content just over 26% total for the package. Harvested June 25th of this year, tested July 16th, and packaged on the 31st of July. So we are only a couple of months removed from that, well within the 4 to 5 month window when I say you really want to be enjoying these things. The mood that they advertised, engaged, floaty, energized. And I would say that I have been all three of those for the last week, that I've really been enjoying these little hits from the Dynavap. I've been on the M7, courtesy of George Brewa, and the great vaporizers they make at Dynavap. If you haven't heard my interviews with him, listener, you want to check those out. But they're making dry herb vaporizing very easy. They have some great handheld devices, and it really allows you to kind of appreciate the subtle distinctions in taste of the different strains you might try. Again, unpaid here. This is just something I love what George has done with Dynavap, and I'm just telling you that if you want to if you've always wondered, like George did, why cannabis will taste differently than it smells when you smoke it, a lot of that comes into the combustion side. When you hold up the flame to the plant, you're burning it. And then by burning it, there's a chemical reaction there. And so as George describes it, the analogy he uses with Dynavap is you're baking your cookies now, not burning them. And so when you're baking them in the little cap of the Dynavap vaporizer, you get to taste the terpenes. Like in this case of the Grandi Wava Tales and Travels flower, the terpenes they list are beta-caryophyllene, limonene, alpha-humulene, linalool, and beta-myrcene. I'm a big fan of the limonene and linalool terpenes myself, and something like a Dynavap or whatever your vaporizer is, something aside from just smoking it allows you to get a lot more nuanced and detailed experience of taste. And anyway, that's what I really got with these Tales and Travels. The sativa is something I lean toward. I like to feel more energized. I did have a little of this in the Dynavap before trying the Sweet Buzz Sweet Sparks, and so those products are doing a little dance in my system now, but either way, I do feel energized, but my thoughts are mostly clear. I would say I feel less floaty and more engaged right now. So that's really been enjoyable, and I want to give a shout out to Krista, the bud tender at the Wrigleyville Sunnyside, who convinced me to give these Tales and Travels Grandi Wava strain a try here. I mentioned sativa was kind of my jam, and we just went through some of the products, found a good deal, and she said this flower isn't normally on a special, so I was able to get it for around $30, and I was able to knock off even more than that by using an app. So anyway, thanks, Krista. Really appreciate the conversation and the recommendation. This is a really good experience for me right now, and I'm definitely going to be going back for more of these. But the app that I used to knock off even more of that price, you may have heard me talk about this last week, but if not, you need to download the app High Rewards. This is the only cannabis rewards app you will ever need. This is great stuff here. Whether you have an Apple product, if you've got an iPhone, if you've got an Android, whatever smartphone you're using, you can download High Rewards, and you give it your email, you give it a username, and you create a password just like anything else, and then allow it to access your location. Because what will happen then is the next time you go into a dispensary, wherever you are, if you're in a legal state, great, you can go down the block. If you're not in a legal state, download High Rewards anyway, and then when you go on a trip to a legal state, you can go into the dispensary, open up High Rewards while you're at the counter before you've even bought anything, and by checking in that dispensary through the High Rewards app, you will already be getting points. And points, by the way, can be redeemed for real-world cash. And I'm not talking pennies on the dollar here. They are very generous right now with these points. You can exchange them for gift cards if you're interested to places like Starbucks and Target and Walmart and Amazon. Or you can do like I did and use your points to buy products at this dispensary. So when I was at the Sunnyside, I was able to knock off real money from my purchase of this flower by using my High Rewards points. And you can too. If you scroll down below the description notes, you will see a link to click on for High Rewards. If you put the promo code CANMAN with 2 N's like Cannabis Man, if you put CANMAN into the promo code bar, you'll get $5 automatically. $5 of real-world cash that you can use at a dispensary through the High Rewards app. So get it downloaded, make your profile. You can get points other ways too, like playing games, taking surveys, answering questions. There's a lot you can do. And then if you upload the receipt from your purchase, you get even way more points So Sunnyside is running a deal right now on high rewards where they're giving you bonus points. This is the time to get in on this. You can really rack these things up quickly, and you'll be getting products out of dispensaries the next time you're there, basically for free, using your high rewards points. So download it now, use the promo code CANMAN for $5. And hey, you're already getting high, you might as well get highly rewarded too. Listener, I am very excited to have my guest. He's been on the show before, but I'm always excited to have a talk with him. There is a lot to speak about regarding legal cannabis. If you listen to the show, you know I talk about these things every single week. And this green frontier, this patchwork legalization we have here in the U.S., as well as different countries starting to legalize around the world, whether for medical or recreational use. These changes bring with them a lot of ripple effects, and there is always, therefore, a lot to talk about. Things that are moved in terms of laws, and then the reactions to them by politicians, by the community at large, by all of us consumers, and the like. And who better to talk about some of these big changes, like the DEA's rescheduling timeline, like the fact that we have 2 presidential candidates on the ticket, and I'm recording this right at the end of September, front end of October, so we're like a month away from a presidential election, and both candidates seem to be on the side of stopping arresting people for cannabis, and plenty more to talk about. Then the deputy director for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, you know it as NORML, my friend Paul Armentano. Welcome back, Paul.
Hey, it's good to be here. I look forward to talking with you.
Thanks, man. Always great to talk with you, too. And you are a busy man, obviously running NORML. You've been in it and fighting this fight for a long time. And I gotta say, you're very active in your publications, too. I'm looking at NORML.org, by the way, listener. You can check out a lot of these articles we're going to be talking about there. But I'm looking at your page here, Paul, and it seems like you're putting stuff out like every week. I love your passion. And how do you find the time to be staying on top of everything?
Good thing that time management is among one of my strong points, because there is not a lot of time and there is a whole lot to manage when it comes to this issue. And we're at a very busy and very pivotal point in time where, as you mentioned, we have an election coming up. We have several states that are in play with marijuana-related initiatives. The DEA has announced for the first time in about 35 or 40 years that there will be administrative law hearings on the subject of rescheduling cannabis. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot to talk about.
We'll be right back.
You know, it really is amazing living in a state where cannabis has been legalized, or a country. It's just really cool still to me to be able to go to a dispensary and buy different products. But what's even more amazing than that is growing your own cannabis at home. And if you're able to do that where you are, but maybe the prospect is a little intimidating. Maybe you've never grown anything by yourself before at home. Maybe you don't have the equipment. Maybe you don't even know where to start. Well, if the idea is appealing to you and you've thought about starting a home grow, allow me to recommend my friends at Bloom's Brothers Hydro. These guys are the best. They know exactly how to get you started or how to improve your grow operation. Wherever you are in your journey, they can help you, and they have the products you need to get this done. They've got lines in stock from Horticulture Lighting Group, Nectar for the Gods, Green Grow, Fox Farm, Royal Gold Soils, and more. And hey, maybe growing cannabis is old hat for you at this point. Maybe you've been doing it for a while, you know all you need to know about it, but maybe you've been looking to expand your garden and add a fungal element to it. You know, cannabis flower is great, but it doesn't go great on a pizza, unlike mushrooms. Those are delicious on a pizza. And if you've been interested in researching this prospect, adding some of that fungus to your own home grow, Bloom's Brothers Hydro has you covered there too. They've got supplies from Uncle Mike's, Southwest Shroomery, Redwood Mushroom Supply, and Dr. Mike's as well. You can find Bloom's Brothers Hydro inside the Apple House on Harding Avenue in Terre Haute, Indiana. They're open 7 days a week, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Saturday, and 11 a.m. to 5 on Sundays. For more information, follow them on Instagram at Apple House Hydro. You can email Fred at theapplehouse.com or call 812-232-1495 to get all the information that you're looking for. Remember, if you're thinking about starting or expanding a home grow, check out the guys at Bloom's Brothers Hydro. Yes, sir. And let's jump right into that because, both of those are key moments. You mentioned it is pivotal for legal cannabis and the journey at large. And you wrote an op-ed recently that says both candidates agree that we need to stop arresting people for cannabis. And let me just start with this question for you. Is this the only election we've had in America where both candidates are outwardly and publicly speaking pro-cannabis legalization?
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. It is definitely the first time we have had presidential candidates on both major party tickets speaking favorably about the need to end marijuana arrests and reform federal marijuana laws. That is not to say that either one of these are making it a priority in their platform or necessarily that they will follow through on these pledges.
Right.
But they are publicly talking about reform. They're doing so in a way that clearly illustrates how mainstream this issue has become. Look, at the end of the day, we're a few weeks out from an election. It's a race that's going to be very tight, and both candidates are pulling out all the stops to appeal to swing voters. And this is an acknowledgement among both parties that advocating for marijuana policy reform is a political opportunity. It's a winning issue with America's voters. And that's why you now see Kamala Harris and Donald Trump both publicly speaking out in favor of ending marijuana arrests and reforming our federal marijuana laws. And again, that is the first time we've seen a presidential ticket where both parties are speaking out favorably on our particular issue.
It is big news. It's been a year full of big news, and none bigger, I would say, than something we also touched on a bit early was the DEA's announcement that they will be holding this administrative hearing now set for December 2nd, and then, whatever comes after that. But that hearing is going to be on the topic of rescheduling cannabis. I've talked about it a lot this year. Talked about it a lot last year, too, when, the Biden administration in October giving that dictum to the DEA to look into rescheduling along with Health and Human Services and whatnot. But, you wrote an op-ed about this as well, and it's something that I've been talking about a lot on the show. There's been a lot of reaction, both positive and negative, after the DEA made their announcement. And I love what your headline was. The take is that no matter what you think about the DEA, and it was always going to be, not a slam dunk. What I mean is that the DEA was always going to drag this through the courts. They were always going to slow walk this process. But ultimately, the hearing, as you say, is an opportunity for advocates to make the case for rescheduling, just like they did in the public comment period earlier in the summer.
Yeah, absolutely. So we knew from the get-go this would not be an expedited process. There have been several petitions to reschedule marijuana in the past. In fact, every single one of those has was far more drawn out than this process has been. And there are a number of steps in this process. And one of those steps is ALJ hearings. So we were never under the impression that that step would be skipped. It was very unlikely that when the first proposed change in marijuana's federal status in over 50 years, that this would happen without such a hearing. So again, it wasn't a surprise to see the DEA announce that this hearing would take place. Right now, they have scheduled it for December 2nd. It is possible that date could be pushed back for any number of reasons. There's also no timeline with respect to how long this hearing will be when it does take place. And one thing that I do think is important for folks to know or understand is that at the conclusion of this hearing, a DEA judge will render a decision with regard to whether he or she is supportive of the proposed rule to move marijuana out of Schedule 1 or whether the judge rules against that. But that is still just yet another step in the process. After that verdict is rendered, the DEA, the agency itself, or the director of DEA, will then publicly either concur or reject that judge's decision. And then at that point, the DEA will issue a final rule, and that final rule can also be subject to further litigation. So again, this is an ongoing process. We're entering the later stages of that process, but there's still plenty of steps to go. But you're correct. We've only had ALJ hearings on this particular topic once before in our history, and that was in 1986. And our arguments back then were so persuasive that the DEA judge in that case didn't just find in favor of the safety and efficacy of marijuana, but the judge in that case ruled that marijuana is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. That was what the evidence showed 4 decades ago, and our case has only grown exponentially stronger now. In addition, in this particular instance, the HHS and FDA have already ruled in favor of the safety and efficacy of marijuana and the idea that marijuana needs to be moved out of Schedule 1. So it's going to be the opponents who somehow are going to have to try to make the case in court that HHS and FDA have somehow erred in this decision to move marijuana out of Schedule 1. And I don't see how they can make that case based on available science and evidence. They couldn't make the case 40 years ago. They certainly can't make the case today.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and I'm glad you laid that out, as you did in your op-ed as well, talking about how 40 years ago, as you say, that DEA judge really, they were convinced of the argument, as you said, that cannabis is the safest therapeutically active among them known to man of those substances. But, as you point out, the agency's administrator ultimately set aside Judge Young's decision for ideological reasons, and we just have to hope that that's not the case this time. But as you point out, the burden of proof is really on the other side now, because those two government bodies, the HHS as well as the White House too, have already kind of come down on the side of rescheduling in favor of that. I know one of the issues that may or may not come up during this administrative hearing is the topic that you wrote on as well, a recent op-ed, which led me to reach out to you again in the first place, which is that a decade into states legalizing, the topic of underage use is always one that comes up. It's been sort of a hallmark of the reefer madness propaganda from last century. It's been a regular rallying cry for those who are opposed to cannabis legalization. The children, won't someone think of the children, please? That sort of idea. And as you point out in your op-ed, underage use has plummeted across states. And I've talked about this on the show. I have my own sort of reasons why I believe it's happened. One of them is just that simply when something is normalized and the adults are doing it, the teens don't really find it cool anymore. And that's one of the things I think that does factor into cannabis as well. But talk a little about underage use across states and how it's gone down since it's been legalized here.
Well, you're absolutely right. If you go back and look at year over year marijuana use data among teenagers, and you go back to 2014, which was when Washington State and Colorado became the first two states to enact adult use marijuana sales. If you track young people's use of marijuana from 2014 to today, it has gone down significantly. Nationwide, it's gone down about 30%. And when you look at individual states that have legalized marijuana, you see a similar decline. This is across age categories, whether you're looking at kids in junior high, whether you're looking at high school students, whether you're looking at daily use, monthly use, yearly use, ever used. This has really been a significant, now long-term trend that has occurred parallel with almost half the states now in this country legalizing and regulating adult use sales. And you can tell that even our opponents have had to acknowledge this point because they've largely moved the goalposts over the last few years. You see now a lot of their discussion is about marijuana use among young adults, which has gone up. We have seen in legal states 20-somethings who can legally access marijuana, not surprisingly, are doing so. And now our opponents are saying, well, that's the concern. When for decades, the concern was always underage or teen use. You no longer hear opponents raising that issue because, again, teen use has fallen so substantially and so consistently over the last decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And great points there, as always, Paul. And something else, the use rates of something else has fallen in states where cannabis has been legalized. And I bring this up a lot on the show as well, which is to say the relationship between alcohol and marijuana. And in the states that have legalized cannabis, you mentioned the young adults using it, certainly more and whatnot. But what has been shown as well is that alcohol consumption rates in states where cannabis is legalized, those also go down. And I find it amusing, I guess, that, people might have their opinions about alcohol, but there have been many recent studies showing that likely there is no amount of alcohol that is entirely safe for people to consume, especially not anyone who might be developing still. But in terms of the young adults, the notion that fewer of them would be consuming alcohol and more of them would be consuming cannabis, I think that may be a good thing, but it gets to a question which I raise often on this show, which is to say the lobbyists and the whole industry of big alcohol, I think just like pharmaceuticals, just like big pharma, and just like, healthcare, there are industries with a lot of money and a lot of interest in keeping cannabis kind of where it is in its current prohibited status. I want to ask you, do you think I'm right about that? What's your opinion about big alcohol and big pharma and whether or not they may be kind of trying to keep their thumb on the scale in terms of, what comes out relating to cannabis news and stuff like that?
So it's an interesting theory. I've been doing this work for 30 years, and I've heard the notion that there are these industries like the pharmaceutical industry, like the alcohol industry, like the tobacco industry, that may have an interest or may benefit from cannabis being illegal, and they may try to pull strings behind the scenes. I can say this. It is very clear in the work that I've done over the years who the primary special interests are that lobby to keep marijuana illegal. And without question, it's law enforcement. And if these other ancillary special interests have a role to play, it is marginal at best. My guess is that if and when cannabis becomes further legally regulated throughout this country and further normalized in this country, that some of the special interests you've talked about, like the alcohol industry, like the pharmaceutical industry, they're going to be partnering and taking advantage of the fact that marijuana is legal in various ways, whether it's through the use of new products or beverages or pharmaceutical products. But I don't think they are playing an active role in maintaining prohibition, but most certainly law enforcement and those particular interests are.
Totally. That does make sense, and I always appreciate your perspective because, as you've mentioned, you've been fighting this fight for decades now, and so your vantage point on a lot of these issues, I always love hearing about it. It also segues nicely into another topic I wanted to bring up. You just mentioned law enforcement. I totally agree with you. It makes the most sense that they have the most vested interest in keeping cannabis prohibited like it is, because it sort of dovetails with their own self-interest in terms of what they can regulate, who they can arrest. And we just last week got the FBI's arrest totals relating to arrests for cannabis possession and other drug-related arrests. I know you're plugged into these things. What did we find out from those FBI numbers?
So the first thing folks need to know is that while the FBI publishes this tally, it used to be called the Uniform Crime Report, now it's called Crime in the United States. The FBI is getting this data from local law enforcement jurisdictions that report their data to the FBI. Now, not all jurisdictions report this data, and some jurisdictions are, let's say, more accurate than others who do report. So at best, the total number we get from the FBI is really an estimate, and it's really an underreport. Because again, we know not all law enforcement agencies are reporting, and we know that among those that do, not all of them actually give us the correct numbers. But given those caveats, what we saw was in the year 2023, at least another 217,000 Americans were arrested for marijuana-related charges. The overwhelming majority of those were arrested for simple marijuana possession, not marijuana trafficking, not marijuana sales. Overall, about 25% of all drug arrests in this country, even today, are still related to marijuana. And again, these numbers are clearly an underreport. One of the reasons I say that so confidently is because, for instance, the state of Florida reported fewer than 3,500 total marijuana arrests for 2023. That number is absolutely false. And we know it. We know that there were at least 16,000 marijuana-related prosecutions in Florida alone. So there were certainly a whole lot more arrests. But that is a state where local law enforcement is notorious for hiding the ball, hiding the data, and not reporting true numbers to the FBI. By contrast, a state like Texas, we saw about 25,000 marijuana-related arrests. In Pennsylvania, there were more than 12,000 marijuana arrests. So while I know a lot of people, particularly people in the media, like to talk about this issue, like marijuana arrests are something of a bygone era, and law enforcement like to claim that nobody gets arrested for marijuana, and certainly nobody goes to jail for marijuana. But the reality is, even today, marijuana arrests and enforcing marijuana laws is a significant driver of drug-related arrests in this country and overall marijuana-related arrests in this country. And in some states like Alabama, nearly half of all drug arrests are for marijuana.
Wow. I mean, it's incredible to hear those numbers. And it also gets at your point, which is to say law enforcement obviously has a vested interest in keeping cannabis where it is in terms of its prohibited status, because that's a lot of man hours right there. That's a lot of, potentially overtime for somebody, booking people into the systems, into the, incarceration systems, the for-profit prisons we have in this country. That fills up a lot of jail cells. And this hypocrisy of, states legalizing and a new industry worth billions being born and moving ahead, and all the new tax revenue, this hypocrisy of that existing in the same moment where, as you said, Paul, nearly a quarter of all drug-related arrests were for cannabis last year. The hypocrisy is as bald-faced as it gets. And I will say it's a small step, but recently here in Illinois anyway, the Supreme Court ruled that the smell of burnt cannabis is no longer justifiable cause for law enforcement to pull over a vehicle and then search them, which may lead to some of these arrests you're talking about. They can still do that in conjunction. They can say they smelled burnt cannabis, but that alone is not enough to sort of justify them stopping a vehicle, which for a long time, I know here in Illinois anyway, that was all the officers needed to say, enough to get somebody into a cell for however long. And I am glad to at least see a step like that taken, and I hope other states do so as well.
Yeah, in fact, that Illinois decision is very similar to decisions that other state Supreme Courts have made throughout this country. Nearly a dozen states have ruled similarly, that when marijuana becomes legal under state law, that the smell of marijuana alone is no longer probable cause that a crime is being committed.
Yeah, which just makes sense. I mean, it's like if it's legal here in the state where you are, you can't just say, well, we smelled it, so there must be a crime here. No, not anymore. You know, one day in the past maybe, but no longer. So it's good to see these Supreme Courts ruling in that direction. You brought up Florida, Paul, and Florida is one of the states that has a cannabis initiative on their ballots come November, and it's definitely one of the more contentious ones, at least in terms of campaigning. I've seen the governor there, Ron DeSantis. I've seen that he has put money into, anti-cannabis ads, making it a part of his own campaign, clearly making an effort and putting money behind efforts to try and defeat this ballot initiative. If you can, just talk a little about how big, obviously with those arrest numbers, there are a lot of people in Florida using cannabis recreationally and perhaps medically. There's obviously a lot of seniors down there too who might use it for various quality of life reasons. But talk about some of the states that have cannabis ballot initiatives and why they might be sort of, another thing that's just really important for these elections come November.
So come November, it is very likely that voters in 4 states will be deciding on various marijuana-related initiatives. The reason I say likely is because even though an initiative in Nebraska to legalize medical marijuana qualified for the ballot, there is ongoing litigation that may potentially push that off the ballot or push it down the road, depending on when a court resolves the issue.
Right.
The other states where this issue is going to be decided on is going to be North Dakota and South Dakota. And as you mentioned, Florida. Florida is clearly the most high-profile campaign. It's a bellwether state. It's the 3rd most populated state in the country. And as you mentioned, both sides, proponents of the campaign have spent a lot of money, and opponents of the campaign, including Governor Ron DeSantis and some of his PACs, are spending a lot of money to try to confuse and mislead voters in the state of Florida about what that initiative will and won't do. The fact is, Florida is a terribly important state when it comes to this issue of legalization, because we've known historically, despite some of the numbers that law enforcement in Florida have turned out in recent years, that the Sunshine State remains one of the marijuana arrest capitals of this country. And Florida right now has some of the strictest marijuana laws and strictest penalties on the books. In fact, in the state of Florida, possession of more than 20 grams is a felony offense. That is the lowest threshold to trigger felony marijuana charges in any state in this country. So eliminating those arrests, eliminating those penalties is a really, really big deal. And that is why we support passage of Amendment 3. It is somewhat limited in what it does, but that's because under the Florida Constitution, issues that go before the voters cannot address more than one issue, or what they define as a single subject. So while there is lots theoretically that could be done and needs to be done legislatively in Florida, the ballot initiative process doesn't allow for such broad reform. All the initiative process can do is focus on one particular issue. And in this case, Amendment 3 would end marijuana arrests in Florida, and it would allow for adult use legal sales of marijuana in Florida. And that would be a major step forward and a major victory for Floridians if it passes. It needs 60%. Unlike every other state where a simple initiative or a constitutional amendment passes with a simple majority, in Florida, you need 60% plus one. That's a fairly high margin, but I'm confident the votes are there.
There you go. I mean, that is huge, as you said there, Paul. And listener, if you or anyone you know, if you got family in Florida, anybody who's a registered voter there, you heard it. If they're undecided or whatever, have them listen to this and tell them to vote to pass Amendment 3 there, because it is crucially important, not just for the people going down for spring break, but the people who live there. And as we said, medical cannabis. When we talk about cannabis, it's not just recreational users here. We're talking about potentially medical users. And, if you don't have your card on you or you don't have, your documentation or whatever, you're risking the potential wrath of law enforcement and any of the penalties that are there on the books, talking about having to do with whatever you're using or how much you have on you. And as Paul said, 20 grams or whatever, that's a little over half of an ounce. And so it is a very, very low threshold. And it's one that I know there are plenty of people who roll around with that. And it's something you may not think about. So Florida really, really is a very big battleground right now, and that this issue is being fought on.
Look at how hard our opponents are fighting this initiative in Florida to know how high the stakes are. I say the same thing when it comes to this issue of rescheduling. I know there's a lot of folks who say, well, I'd like to see marijuana removed from the Controlled Substances Act completely.
Yeah.
We would too. But
Yep.
This is an important first step, and it's a pivotal first step. And again, you can tell by the fact that our opponents are all in to try to oppose even this gradual step forward, because they know that the stakes are very high.
Yeah, well said. And I hear those same people too, Paul. And it's like, I get that. You know what I mean? It's like, it would be great if they could just, throw the gates open and be like, well, we made a mistake. The DEA just comes out and holds a presser and they're like, these last 50 years, we really fucked up. We thought it was one way and it turns out it's another. But you know what? We live in reality. We live in America in the real world, and that's not what's going to happen. What is going to happen is we move forward gradually, and we take these incremental steps, and the step of rescheduling is a big one. And states like Florida deciding to legalize and that is another chip in the wall. And it's just, these are important steps, even though they don't feel like, oh, this is the dream, this is all of the goal. You don't, eat the whole elephant at once. It's one bite at a time. And these things are important. Paul, one more question for you too. As you said, you've been fighting this fight for 30 years. You've been doing this for decades. And so you were in it at a point where during last century, during the 80s and the 90s, when the reefer madness propaganda was at its height, and we all in the public education system where I went, we had these DARE officers coming in and showing us the videos of scrambled eggs and saying, what we should and shouldn't, do in terms of substances in our bodies. Well, there's a study that came out recently talking about how sustained use of medical cannabis is not associated with changes in the brain, the layout of your brain, or any cognitive performance, which obviously may have been a big sigh of relief to anybody who was concerned about it. I think it's kind of, anyone who's used it for a long time probably already knew that. But when for someone like you who's been fighting this for so long, continues to hear the same kinds of reefer madness propaganda, the same stereotypes creep up, and then studies like this one come out, and it doesn't really seem to be picked up nationally in favor of people repeating the same stuff over and over again. I guess to say, do you ever get tired of this? Doesn't it feel like you just wish that people would pay attention more in mass to the little studies versus the stereotypes that seem to have such a grip on the collective consciousness out there?
Yeah, absolutely. When I got into this issue 30 years ago, I had this notion that if we changed the narrative surrounding marijuana, if we changed the way we as a society talked about marijuana, then we would begin to change the way people thought about marijuana. And once we did that, ultimately the policies surrounding marijuana would change. So it was very important to me to reframe the way we talked about the issue and to make sure the public was aware of the science and evidence surrounding marijuana so that we could begin to cast away some of these long-term stereotypes that have existed for decades, but were never really based on any sound evidence. The study that you're talking about, which again was an important study, but the result of that study was a consistent result. We have studies looking at long-term marijuana use and its potential impact on cognition and brain morphology going back several decades. And the consensus of those studies is that it doesn't change brain chemistry and that it doesn't have lasting impacts on cognition. Again, we've known these findings for quite some time, so of course it is frustrating when you hear people say things like, well, we just don't know enough about marijuana, or it just hasn't been studied enough. The fact is that we know more about cannabis, its active components, and the societal and behavioral effects of cannabis than we do about most other psychotropic substances. Look, you brought up alcohol recently, and you brought up this recent study that has just come out a few days ago that essentially said there's no safe amount of alcohol.
Right.
And that if one continues to drink alcohol over the age of 60, their rates of certain cancers skyrockets. This is fairly new information. Both you and I grew up in an era where there was a fairly strong belief that 1 or 2 drinks of alcohol or wine a day could be healthy.
Right.
And now the science is saying we were wrong on that. In fact, alcohol in almost any amount is toxic. My point is we're still learning about the harms and dangers of alcohol and so many of these other substances, whereas we have well-established science with regard to marijuana. I dare say we know more about marijuana and its effects than we know about alcohol, but seldom is the narrative portrayed that way. And it's very frustrating to see a study like the one you're talking about, looking at medical marijuana in the brain, that was published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, get so little attention.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you're right on about alcohol, as I talked about earlier. I also think lately about the proliferation of things like Ozempic and these weight loss things that seem to have been eagerly adapted by much of society when we can't possibly know nearly enough to make long-term informed decisions about the risks of that. But people are still going to sort of hem and haw about medical cannabis over years. Meanwhile, they're going to rush over to Walgreens, pay $1,500 a month for semaglutide or whatever that is, and have no qualms about that.
Yeah, it's one of the things that makes our understanding of cannabis so unique, is that cannabis has been around for millennium, and human beings in societies have used cannabis for all of this time, giving us a very unique perspective and understanding of what happens to societies, what the long-term impact of cannabis may be. Whereas these other particularly these sort of novel pharmaceutical substances that come to market, we have no idea what the long-term effects are because no human beings have yet used those substances long-term. And so again, that context I think is very, very important. Modern societies have been using cannabis regularly for at least the last 50 years to the last century. When you talk about some of these newer drugs or statins or any of these new classes of drugs, we'll only know about the long-term effects of these drugs in the future long term, but we know what the long-term effects of cannabis are.
On that note, one final thought, Paul, is I think the advertising has a lot to do with it. I think all of us, we see these commercials every single day, not just for alcohol, but for some of the pharmaceuticals. You know, some new one hits the market and there's immediately a campaign where you're seeing ads every single break where somebody's singing a catchy song, talking about how great their life is because they got this new shot that they take once a month. My question to you is, do you think the rescheduling will open things up? If it happens next year, do you think the rescheduling down to Schedule 3 will mean more advertising for cannabis companies?
Theoretically, it could. Right now, so obviously there is going to be still this tension between state policies and federal policies.
Sure.
And in many legal states, there are state-specific restrictions on advertising or what kind of advertising is permitted and what kind of advertising isn't. But certainly any federal restrictions with regard to advertising are linked to the fact that cannabis is Schedule 1. And if cannabis is no longer Schedule 1, those federal restrictions on advertising, at least temporarily, would be lifted. Obviously, the federal government or federal agencies that regulate trade and interstate commerce could then create new regulations if they wish to. But yes, it could potentially open the door for advertising. This is something I actually am personally very mixed on, because I, like you, take issue with how aggressively pharmaceuticals are advertised, with how aggressively alcohol is advertised. You know, when my son was much younger and we used to watch baseball games on television, the amount of alcohol advertising that he was exposed to,
oh my God,
was tremendous.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily want to see marijuana advertised and with the same sort of ubiquity as some of these other products are, because I don't think that's necessarily good for a healthy society.
I totally agree with you, man. And it is, the proliferation of ads in general. I do think it's just, it has an impact, and all we can hope is that, kind of as we do move forward, that it is sort of when cannabis does get rescheduled, if and when it does, hopefully very soon and whatnot, that we can kind of walk forward in a more responsible way as we inform people of the potential quality of life improvements, but also just the important information they need to know about it. And I gotta say, nobody puts out that kind of information as regularly and as in a high quality way as you do. Paul Armentano, the Deputy Director of NORML. Listener, again, you can head to NORML, NORML.org, and you can read all of these great op-eds that Paul regularly puts out and some of the important information like we're talking about here. Thanks as always for stopping by today, Paul. Great to talk with you.
Hey, always a good time to speak with you. Let's do it again soon.
And there you have it, listener. I want to thank one more time my guest, Paul Armentano of NORML. Just such a valuable perspective from somebody who's been in this fight for as long as he has and doing the great work fighting this stigma, which still persists, as we were talking about. It's just one of those things where people say, they've said for years, a lie can circle the world 5 times before the truth has its breakfast, and, or something to that effect. I'm sure there's an updated version of that phrase, but either way, these stereotypes, these sort of propaganda lines from last century, they have a way of persisting. This stigma has a stickiness to it that is really, really not easy to shake. And the normalization that is being done by the work at NORML, by people like Paul, as well as by states that are legalizing and then just putting products on shelves and normalizing it to that degree, as well as hopefully the rescheduling and eventual maybe legalization of cannabis, at least decriminalization. That's going to do so much more for normalizing the plant and killing these stigmas as this prohibition ends slowly than anything else that anybody could do. But very excited to talk with him always. And, as you heard in that interview, we talked about a few different things, one of which is the big contested issue of cannabis legalization in Florida. That is a big state for the reasons that Paul laid out, as well as the fact that, lots of people live there. There's a whole ton of crimes that are still reported in that state or underreported. reported rather, but, people covering it like Paul who are on top of it can see that the prosecutorial records are not at all consistent with those arrest numbers totals that they reported. So you can see how big of an issue this is down in Florida. And the campaigning is definitely heating up. Again, we are, depending on when you're listening to this, we're around a week out from the election now. And there is an article from floridapolitics.com that I'm reading here. I've linked it below. But the author, Jacob Ogles, perhaps, put this out just yesterday from when I'm recording this, October 23rd. And the headline reads, Jack Campbell worries legalizing weed will make it hard to find criminal dealers. And then there's a quote to start it here, my drug dealers are not going to go away, end quote. Jacob Ogles starts the article, prosecutors may not crack down on marijuana possession like they did decades ago, but Leon State Attorney Jack Campbell said laws outlawing pot remain valuable to prosecutors dispensing justice. The top prosecutor, that would be Jack Campbell, in Florida's Second Judicial Circuit, Campbell has criticized a ballot measure, Amendment 3, which could legalize recreational weed in Florida. One of the most prominent Democrats in Florida opposed to Amendment 3, Jacob goes on. He said the criminal justice system can responsibly handle execution of Florida's laws with discretion and should not lose a valuable tool. Quote, for many years now, certainly before medical marijuana, I think the state's policies on cannabis have evolved, certainly with this office, Campbell said. He goes on, we've been doing diversion for many years, which results in a dismissal of charges. There have been various forms of what's often called civil side, civil citation, but the prosecutorial discretion concerning marijuana has evolved over the last years, end quote. He acknowledges that the approval of medical cannabis in a 2016 constitutional amendment marked a significant change in policy, but he said societal attitudes around cannabis use changed over time, and so has treatment of the substance by the criminal justice system. Quote, probably in the 70s and 80s you had the height of the Say No to Drugs campaign, and as cannabis has become more popular in society, we have kind of evolved as we've been dealing with other drugs, he said. Now, having said that, there's a lot of crimes that are marijuana related that we see as a real problem. Now, I'm not going to read any more of this, but again, please read the full article. I always encourage you to do that. That's why I link them below. But the reason that I shared this with you is to kind of present this other side of this issue. It gets to something Paul and I were talking about, which is the investment that law enforcement has in maintaining the status quo. As we talked about, those arrest numbers equate to very real-world investments in those law enforcement bodies, from the DEA right down to a prosecutor's office in a Florida district. These people, whether they're cops, lawyers, prison guards, whatever, they have a vested interest in keeping cannabis a restricted and very controlled substance because it directly ties into their funding, their manpower, and their ability to regulate and kind of generally enforce laws that the rest of us have to abide by. Now, this is a Democrat, the author does note, and one of the highest ranking ones in this judicial circuit court. So this is not a nobody. And being a Democrat, it just goes to show this is a bipartisan issue, but there is no guarantee of how any individual in either party feels exactly about this. And that's kind of the point that I mean to bring up and sort of why I decided to share this with you. The notion of cannabis regulation being a tool for those in law enforcement that they don't want to lose. That is something that this Florida lawyer says, and that is likely something we're going to continue hearing up to the administrative hearing December 2nd, where the DEA, or that judge rather, is going to make a ruling on the rescheduling of cannabis. But again, that article's below, and by all means, check it out for yourself. But on the notion of politicians kind of on whichever side choosing their own stance on cannabis, there is an article from Marijuana Moment that just came out earlier today from when I'm recording this, October 24th. And the headline reads, J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate on the Republican side, admits fentanyl-laced marijuana is rare. despite constantly raising the alarm about it on the campaign trail. That is the headline from Kyle Yeager in this Marijuana Moment article, which I have linked below. Always encourage you to read their stuff. It's a great publication. I won't read the whole thing. I'm just going to go through the meat of it here. Senator Vance, former President Donald Trump's vice presidential running mate, is acknowledging that fentanyl-laced marijuana is a relatively rare occurrence, despite the fact that he repeatedly sounded the alarm about the issue during his stump speech on the campaign trail. This came in an interview with comedian Theo Von, which came out this week. The two discussed drug policy focusing on the fentanyl crisis. At one point, Vaughn also lamented how the infusion of the potent opioid into the drug supply has meant people can't, quote, even do cocaine in this country anymore without risking a fentanyl overdose, drawing laughs from the senator, who agreed that the problem has deprived people of the chance to make, quote, stupid mistakes without potentially dying as a result. But, as Kyle goes on, while Vance has beaten the drum at multiple recent campaign stops about incidents of cannabis being contaminated with fentanyl, pitting blame on border policies under the Biden-Harris administration, he clarified in the conversation that he doesn't actually believe those cases are widespread. Vance said he'd spoken with a DEA official about the, quote, explosion of drug trafficking in recent years and added, you hear about stories, and I don't think it happens that much, thank God, but somebody smokes a joint, it's laced with fentanyl, and they go into a coma. Vaughn, who has been open about his past struggles with cocaine, said he's had 7 friends who've died from drug overdoses, and the senator said, quote, with the harder stuff, it happens a lot. I'm going to play a little audio from that podcast right now.
I mean, this is ridiculous to say probably that somebody can't, you can't even do cocaine in this country anymore, And that seems like a crazy thing to say. And don't say that. But I said it. But
I like that Vance let out a little wheeze laugh there. I do it myself. I definitely do a wheeze laugh, but I did not expect that from him. He was genuinely tickled by Theo Von's remark there. But let's keep going.
But don't say that anymore.
I'm going to steal that line. That's after the election, though, man.
No.
We got to win first.
It's unfortunate.
To be clear to those watching, I've never done cocaine before.
Yeah, and
I've made many mistakes, but not that one.
Nobody's saying but it's just it's unfortunate.
Nobody thought that, JD Vance. Nobody thought that you did cocaine. People have accused you of romancing a couch, a sofa, some sort of living room furniture. Nothing about cocaine, though.
I don't even know where to
I know
go.
what you mean, but it's unfortunate that look,
you said,
everybody makes mistakes,
right?
Everybody makes mistakes, right? And with harder stuff, it happens a lot. Like I think with you hear about it being laced in marijuana, but not that much.
Yeah.
But I mean, your point about cocaine, pills, you have to be careful.
So there it was, listener. That's the you hear about it being laced in marijuana, but not that much. And the not that much is still covering a gap which really doesn't exist, or implying a gap that doesn't really exist. And what I mean is what Kyle goes on to point out in the article. A recent federally funded study found that there's, quote, no evidence that marijuana is widely being laced with fentanyl. But at various previous campaign events, Vance has made much of the issue. And even that little caveat of what he just said in the podcast, not that much, still implies that there is some. But the study found no evidence that that's happening in any kind of wide basis that someone would need to say, oh, well, we have to be careful of this. Cocaine, white powder drugs, it just makes sense that that's easier to lace with fentanyl and not have somebody know about it. Cannabis, you can't really get away with that stuff, even with the moon rocks and stuff like that. It's just not the same. So, it's interesting that Vance kind of, sort of admitted to that. But my point being that these politicians on either side might have their own personal opinions about it, and some of them, again, like anybody's opinion, some of them are based on fact, some of them are based on hearsay and rumor and stereotype. But, people are allowed their opinions, but this is somebody who is running to be vice president. And, on the other side, I'll just point out, Tim Walz, who was governor of Minnesota, which is a state that a lot of other states are looking at to model their legal cannabis framework after. And the other ticket has gone on to say that they would go further than rescheduling, but they would go full legalization. So this is just something I kind of brought up because we stand here very near the election, and I'm not sure which country or state you're listening from. You may not be at all involved in the U.S. election other than to kind of, hear who ends up winning the race and then just saying, okay, anyway, I'm going to go on with my life now, which is true for a lot of us, sure. But here in the country, we have a civic duty to cast a vote. And if you're of voting age, and whether you served or not in the military, whether you've served in any kind of branch of government, or you do any volunteering work for charity or the National Guard, anything like that, no matter what else you do, the privilege of being an American citizen comes with the expectation that you will do something to protect this democracy. And the very least that we can do on that front is to cast a vote. And I'd love it if people paid attention to their local elections too, but I'm not going to, set the bar at an unrealistic level here. Okay, I'm going to try and stick to attainable goals. And I think voting in a national presidential election is a great place to start. It's an easy one. You got 2 candidates, 4 if you include the vice presidents, everybody on the tickets, but it's important to do it. And it's part of maintaining this privilege. Like I said, it is the basic duty we have from living here. And so if you're a U.S. citizen and you're living in the country and you're of voting age, whoever your candidate is, don't matter to me, but get out and vote because, this is a privilege. And there is no guarantee that it lasts forever. Just because if you're like me, you were born into it and, it was already 200 years into the experiment. Countries in Asia and Europe they have buildings older than 250 years. They've got institutions, they've got families that have been living in the same houses for 3 times that long, So it's really not that long cosmically. It's not that long in terms of like Earth history or even human society's history. So to sort of act like it's guaranteed to continue, that is just simply not the case. And voting is really the way that we can at least take part in making sure that it goes on and is able to continue for our kids and their kids. And speaking of children's children, I wanted to end on a lighter note, listener. There has been a lot of great stuff coming from Snoop Dogg over the last few years. I've heard him described in a few different ways, the internet's uncle. I've heard people kind of say in memes that he has beaten the main quest line. If you're a video game fan, he's beaten the main story, and now he's just knocking out side quests, basically. He's a judge on The Voice now. He was able to carry the Olympic torch, which, as I said, during the Summer Olympics looked a lot like a blunt. He made headlines recently for the smokeless stove campaign, where he was, saying he was giving up smoke and whatnot. His marketing team has just been on fire. And there was another story about he was looking to hire somebody to be his professional blunt roller. He has said that he estimates that he goes through like 80 blunts a day. And now there's another headline that's come out regarding another person on Snoop Dogg's staff, somebody who has another responsibility. And I was notified about this from another article from Marijuana Moment. This is also from Kyle Yeager earlier this week. And this article's headline is that Snoop Dogg confirms he has a staffer who makes sure people he's smoking marijuana with don't get too high. So basically, Snoop has a chaperone or a wraparound for Snoop, or maybe a Snooperone. I'm workshopping that. That was just a live workshop there. I don't know if any of them work. They might all end up on the cutting room floor here. But either way, Snoop Dogg's entourage includes a staffer whose task is to make sure people smoking with Snoop don't get too high and telling them, quote, that's enough when they've reached their limit. This came during an appearance on Watch What Happens Live with Andy Cohen that aired Sunday of this week. That would be October 20th.
Sue T wants to know, who was the lightest weight smoker you've ever lit up with?
Damn, who was lightweight? There's so many of them. They featherweights. There's too many to name, baby. Why don't you come join me so I can add you to the list?
I have joined you, and I did okay. But Snoop has a guy with him when he gets you high who kind of says, hey, stop.
That's enough.
Yeah.
That's enough. I love it. I just think, you're Snoop, you're smoking 80 blunts a day. You don't know what people's tolerance are. I mean, maybe some days you're smoking with Willie Nelson and the guy can keep pace, but other days, maybe you're smoking with a true featherweight. And it's like they have the one blunt and they're just like glassy-eyed and, seeing 1,000 yards away and just completely retrospective on their entire existence and all of that. And you need a chaperone right then. When that blunt comes around again in the rotation, you need someone to be there and just kind of lower your hand down and say, hey, man, you're good. You've had enough. Let's just take a deep breath. Let's have some water. Let's walk it off outside. Let's get you back more toward the medium. Let's get you back toward the middle, where you want to be. Let's find your core rotation again. And everything will be all right. The whole set and setting. But I love the idea of having a chaperone, and definitely protects a guy like Snoop from some liabilities too, I'm sure. You don't want somebody leaving the party and then calling the next day like, hey man, I went to 7-Eleven and I just, completely emptied my bank account on snacks. I woke up surrounded by Slurpees. I had, bags of half-eaten Cheetos and the whole works. And hey man, you did this to me. And it's like, no, I didn't. Because my guy kept you from getting to that level, and we sent you home okay. So I love the notion of it, and it's just another kind of example of the cool stuff of the internet's uncle's existence, that being Snoop Dogg. Love what this guy is just giving to us on a daily basis, and boy, definitely on the Mount Rushmore of smokers out there. Cheech and Chong and Snoop and Willie Nelson. There's a long list there, but definitely a real important guy in this whole cannabis campaign to continue legalizing and having the reputation of it be one of geniality, being one of happy and fun and good times. That is definitely something that Snoop is bringing to the party, and I'm here for it, man. I hope this guy just keeps doing exactly what he's doing for many, many years to come. And in the years to come, we are all going to benefit from the continuing progress made in the field of legal cannabis. We have an election coming up, and after that, we'll see where things stand. But either way, there is that hearing on December 2nd, and I will continue to be here bringing you news stories in the meantime on the Cannabis Man podcast, as well as the weekly Chronic newsletter. Again, you can subscribe at that below, and make sure you leave a rating for the show or review it. Subscribe, share it with your friends, and you can always text the show as well. Text Cannabis Man, link is below in the description notes, or send me an email if there's any products or people you think I should interview, any topics you'd like to see covered in depth, anything. I love hearing from you, or if you want to share your thoughts on some of the products that I've reviewed, which today included the Sweet Sparks After Dark from Sweet Buzz, and I'll be getting to some more of their products too, and along with Tales and Travels from Revolution, the Grandi Wava strain of sativa flower that I've really been enjoying. Those are some things. If you try either one of those, let me know what you thought of it, because I really enjoyed them both, and I can't wait to get into more of what Sweet Buzz sent over. They have a whole line of stellar-looking products, and I'll tell you all about my experience with those. In the meantime, blaze up, enjoy the day, go out and enjoy some of this beautiful fall weather, spend time with those you love and care about. Tune in next week. I'll have another expert interview, and in the meantime, you can get more stories every Tuesday on the Weekly Chronic, and we'll talk next week on the Cannabis Man podcast. Bye-bye. Cannabis Man is 100% originally crafted by myself, Don Kleppen. Original theme music written and composed by Yusu Kim, aka Good Son.